About this year is the French Revolution. Last year I talked to you about the Reformation, which was really a war against the church. This year, in talking about the French Revolution, one can only describe it as a war against God. In the first part of my talk, I'll be giving you some background to the state of France before the Revolution, and in the second part we shall deal with the terror. So I should come on time for the second part, which is going to be far more interesting than the first part. I've also added, as we have so many Americans here, a few reflections on American attitudes to the French Revolution, especially that of Thomas Jefferson, which I think you'll find quite interesting. I shan't be criticizing Thomas Jefferson at all, I'm just telling you what he said. Though I did feel rather... Any of you who've seen the film The Blues Brothers, when they went to that country music bar, that I'd like to have a kind of cage along here in case all the bottles start flying through the air. I was surprised to hear there are some people who haven't seen the Blues Brothers. Well, anyway, to go back then to 1789, the year the French Revolution began, France was the most populous and prosperous country in Europe. Paris was its largest city. It had a population of 650,000, who were the best educated and most excitable people in the whole of Europe. Despite this prosperity, there was, however, great social inequality in France, and there are many aspects of French life in which reforms, and even drastic reforms, were needed when Louis XVI came to the throne in May 1774. As you probably remember from the Reformation, if the Church had reformed herself in time, the Reformation wouldn't have taken place, and if all the reforms that were needed in France had been implemented before the Revolution, then the Revolution wouldn't have taken place. The French state, as it existed at that time, had developed since the early Middle Ages by a haphazard process of military conquest and dynastic marriages. The independent feudal domains, which had been progressively absorbed into the Kingdom of France, varied in size from the huge province of Brittany to the narrow strip of Flanders. Even the precise number of provinces in pre-revolutionary France is uncertain, but there are at least 39 provincial governorships. In almost every case, all the provinces, however small, have been allowed to keep their local laws and customs. Apart from royal edicts on certain general issues, there are no laws or administrative practices which applied to the entire realm of France. Southern provinces were regulated by written Roman law, but in the Pyrenees, which of course is in the south, local customs reigned supreme. This was also the case in northern France, where there were 65 general customs and 300 local ones. Laws relating to marriage, inheritance, and tenure of property differed in important respects from one district to another. Every district had its own system of weights and measures, but the same name, say for the same weight in one district, the amount you got for that could be different in about 20 different places, so you never knew what you were going to get. And as a result of all these differences, there was an incessant stream of petty litigation in the law courts at the bottom of the vast pyramid of the French legal system. So, as is always everywhere in every country throughout history, pre-revolutionary France was a great place to be a lawyer, because you always had plenty of work. Now, the tax system also was far from uniform and far from fair. The main direct tax, called the taille, was levied on persons in some provinces and on land in other provinces. Those in the north bore a much heavier tax burden than those in the south. There was a salt tax, the notorious gabelle, and that was levied at 6 different rates throughout the kingdom, while 6 districts, including the vast province of Brittany, didn't pay it at all. Taxes were not paid directly to the government, but were farmed out to some of the wealthiest men in France, who were called the farmers general. And a large proportion of the royal revenue is deducted to increase the wealth of the farmers and build their beautiful chateau on the Loire. A tour of the chateau on the Loire is a well worth holiday, by the way. Almost every aspect of life in France involving finance was farmed out for ready cash. These were known as venal offices, of which I'll say a little more later. The office was sold, the royal treasury received the ready cash, and then the purchaser of the office needed to recoup his initial outlay and make an income for himself. Venal offices provided incomes for an army of bureaucrats who were referred to as leeches of the poor. The most hated leech, of course, being the tax collector. because in the time of our Lord with the Romans, as you know, they farmed out the taxes to tax collectors, which is why tax collectors were hated then. I suppose that's the same in every country and every time. So these farmers general, they employed a host of mini leeches to collect the money for them, and each mini leech had to take his cut. The entire country was crisscrossed with an internal system of customs barriers at the gates of towns, along rivers, or between provinces. The rate of tax on a limitless range of items differed from district to district. To give just one example, if you wanted to ship goods down the rivers Saône and the Rhône from Franche-Comté to the Mediterranean, you had to pay duty at 36 public and private customs barriers. So it's hardly surprising that smuggling was a very, very popular industry. In France, there were 13 parliaments or sovereign courts of appeal, and they all guarded their ancient privileges fiercely. The Parlement of Paris was the largest, and it had jurisdiction over a third of France. There were even areas of France that didn't come under the jurisdiction of the king. Avignon, the surrounding area, belonged to the Pope. Parts of Alsace came under the sovereignty of German princes, and there was even an independent city-state called Mulhouse. What I'm going to say now is very important to understand France before the Revolution, and that is that peasants accounted for 80% of the French population. I believe in France today they have the highest proportion of peasants or small farmers in the whole of Europe. So only 1/5 of Louis XVI's subjects actually lived in communities of more than 2,000 people. French peasants were actually better off than their counterparts anywhere in Europe, except perhaps those of northern Italy. But their prosperity depended entirely on good harvests, and a bad harvest, let alone a series of them, could reduce vast numbers of peasants to abject poverty. Bad harvests also resulted in food shortages and high prices in the large towns and cities, and almost invariably in riots, above all in Paris. Paris is famous for its rioting. Bread made up 3/4 of the ordinary people's diet, so French cooking wasn't always terribly exciting, I wouldn't think. There were very serious riots in 1775, just before the coronation of Louis XVI, and they were set off by a rise of more than 50% in the price of bread. These riots, actually, they're referred to as the Flour War. I believe sometime in America you had a whiskey war, which sounds far more interesting. I think whiskey might be worth fighting over, but not flour. But anyway, this Flour War required the intervention of the army, hundreds of arrests, 2 public executions, and the imposition of strict price controls to restore order. In 1778, the southern cities of Grenoble, Toulouse, and Bordeaux were scenes of serious rioting after harvest shortfalls. Some of the principal complaints concerning the old regime had been rectified during the reign of Louis XVI, who was a very, very considerate king who loved his people dearly, and his first concern was for their welfare. But he was also weak and vacillating when faced with a crisis. The king had abolished one of the most hated taxes. Well, it wasn't a tax, it was compulsory labor. It was called the corvée. And peasants, as a condition of living on the land which belonged to their feudal overlords, had to build roads and repair roads, and they didn't like doing that. That had been abolished. Serfs had been liberated. Almost up to that time, there were still serfs in France. Torture to obtain confessions had been prohibited. The medieval guild system, which some people found far too restrictive because it made it hard to get into certain professions, that had been abolished. Jews were freed of discriminatory taxes. Must have made them very happy. More foundling homes and schools for blind and deaf-mute children were established. Protestants were emancipated from all discriminatory laws in 1797. Actually, and that was to the outrage of the faithful in the Catholic districts of France. Louis also realized the pressing need for tax reforms in the interest of his poorest subjects. The taxes of the poorest part of our subjects have increased in proportion, much more than all the rest, he insisted. The king hoped that rich people would not think themselves wronged when they will have to meet other charges which long since they should have shared with the poor. The king established pawn shops to lend money to the poor at 3%. He also proposed to abolish the dungeons at Vincennes and to raise the Bastille to the ground as part of a program of prison reform. The most evident social phenomenon at the time of the accession of Louis XVI was the rise of the bourgeoisie. The privileged classes in France seldom made up more than a fifth of the population of any town. Only the town, not the country. For the country as a whole, it was a much smaller population. Their income and their lifestyle were far beyond the dreams of the ordinary Frenchman. With the exception of a few master craftsmen, they did not work with their hands. There were about 2.75 million members of this privileged class, and all of them, but for a few 100,000 nobles and clerics, were members of the bourgeoisie. Members of this class were certainly the least religious section of Catholic France. They'd all been indoctrinated with the Enlightenment. With their superior education obtained in Catholic schools and their great wealth, they thanked the God in whom they did not believe that they were not as other men. They were indifferent or even hostile to organized religion, and they looked upon the ordinary clergy in particular with amused contempt. They believed that the past had bequeathed a huge mass of ignorance, prejudice, and superstition which enlightened men had a duty to eradicate. Avid disciples of Rousseau, the philosophe, and Voltaire, they preferred to be guided by science and philosophy rather than religion. And what religion they professed was deist rather than Catholic. The encyclopedia was their catechism. C.C. O'Brien writes, the court was officially Christian, specifically Catholic, while the staple activity of the philosophes was ridiculing Catholicism in the mode of their archetype and exemplar Voltaire. They were highly influential and uniformly well disposed towards the United States, partly because of its exemplary lack of a church establishment. Between the reign of Louis XIV, who died in 1714, and the accession of Louis XVI, the number of bourgeoisie increased threefold, while the population as a whole grew only by a quarter. Their share of the national wealth was enormous. Most industrial and almost all commercial capital was bourgeois-owned, and they bought up a quarter of the land. The source of bourgeois enrichment was the extraordinary commercial and industrial expansion of 18th century France. Industry and trade were flourishing in France as never before, and the revolution was to prove a great setback in this field, as would also be the case with the Russian Revolution of 1917. So you know, before the Russian Revolution of 1917, Russia exported corn to the whole of Europe. It was called the Granary of Europe, and it's still having now to buy corn from the United States. Simon Schama, in his book Citizens, and if you want to get a book on the revolution, that's really one to begin with, Simon Schama's book Citizens, or William Doyle's Oxford History of the French Revolution. So Simon Schama says, the old regime then was not a society doddering on its way to the grave. Far from appearing moribund, signs of dynamism and energy may be found wherever the historian looks. Despite their supposed devotion to philosophy and science, the bourgeoisie were motivated by two principal preoccupations, one might even say obsessions. The first was to increase their wealth, particularly by buying government stock and the acquisition of more and more land, both for its intrinsic value and for the social prestige that it imparted. Their second preoccupation was the acquisition of noble status. Their relationship with the aristocracy was certainly one of love-hate. They despised the nobles as social parasites, but wished to become nobles themselves. The best method of attaining this end was to obtain an ennobling office. The French is to be anobli. This was a public office which conferred automatic nobility on the man appointed to it. And how did one obtain such offices? The answer is that one purchased them, hence the term venal offices. Selling public offices had become an essential source of revenue for the French crown, and there were at least 50,000 of them during the reign of Louis XVI. Once an office had been purchased, it could, by payment of an annual tax, be passed on to the heirs of the office holder or resold to a third party. The insatiable desire of the bourgeoisie to obtain these offices made them an excellent financial investment, and the price of these offices rocketed up in the decades prior to the Revolution. Only 3,700 of these offices conferred automatic nobility, and in most cases they needed to be held by the same family for 2 generations before the noble title could be inherited. One very interesting office was that of the King's Secretary. If you became the King's Secretary, you were ennobled immediately and completely, and being the King's Secretary involved no duties whatsoever. You didn't have to do anything. You just paid a vast sum of money to become the King's Secretary, and the King had 819 secretaries who did nothing at all, but all became nobles automatically as a result of obtaining this position. This office was despised by the ancient and hereditary aristocracy. They really looked down on these bourgeois parvenus, and they called these offices soap for scum, savonnette à vilain in French. Through the purchase of venal offices and other avenues for entering the noble state, about 7,000 people left the bourgeoisie for the nobility during the 18th century, which, with their families, amounted to a total of about 40,000 new members of the aristocracy. It has been estimated that at least a quarter of the French nobility in 1789 had been ennobled since the beginning of the century, indicating that the nobility was an open elite and not a hereditary caste apart from the rest of the people. The ancient noble families considered that the essence of nobility lay in the fact that it was hereditary, passed on from fathers to their children in the blood. The true nobility, they believed, were those whose lineage was lost in the mists of time. Those who were ennobled, they said, could ape them, but they could never really join them. There was a distinct lack of logic in this attitude, as the conferring of nobility was a prerogative of the king. No matter how far back you went in the midst of time, a noble title had originally been conferred by the king. And by more or less denying the king's right to confer nobility upon the bourgeoisie, the ancient families were really denying the king one of his highest prerogatives. On the other hand, I can see that it seems reasonable to make a distinction between a title that had been awarded to reward some glorious deed of chivalry in the service of France and one which had been purchased at what amounts virtually to an auction. The principal objective of the bourgeoisie in obtaining nobility was the acquisition of social prestige, even though they knew very well that they were despised by the hereditary nobility unless they happened to have a daughter who had a huge dowry attached to her. And the hereditary nobility were always very, very anxious to snap up these daughters. And they used to call it to re-gild their arms, to bring in some money. In his History of the Revolution, William Doyle writes, "Nobility was a club which every wealthy man felt entitled, indeed obliged to join. Not all nobles by any means were rich, but sooner or later all the rich ended up noble." What were the benefits of nobility apart from the social prestige? They formed a social estate or order in society, and they looked down upon all who were not noble as commoners, roturiers in French. All the king's ministers were noble, and the royal court was peopled exclusively by nobles. Nobles took precedence on public occasions, they carried swords, and they had coats of arms. They could be tried only in special courts. They didn't go in the same courts as the ordinary people. And they had some wonderful privileges. One of the privileges they had, that if they were going to be executed, they could only be decapitated, which must have been very, very comforting. Troops could not be billeted upon nobles. They could not be conscripted into the militia, and they were exempt from the hated gabelle, the salt tax. And above all, they were exempted from paying the tire, the basic tax. The privilege of not paying tax dated right back to the Middle Ages, when every nobleman was obliged to risk his life in the service of his country, and they weren't expected to contribute money as well. Well, at the time, that sounded quite reasonable. There is no exact information on the number of hereditary nobles. Estimates range from 120,000 to 350,000. They owned about a quarter of the land in France, which was a proportion already equalled by the bourgeoisie, but they also possessed feudal rights over their tenants. Commissions in the army were restricted to nobles. You could never be an officer in the army unless you were a noble. And they could be purchased. So you could purchase a commission in the army. You couldn't in the navy, because in the navy, which Mr. Fallon will confirm, being a sailor himself, in the navy your prime quality needed is skill and ability. So if you didn't know what you were doing, you could crash a ship into the rocks or sink it. So in the Navy, you got on in the Navy by ability. But anyway, very few hereditary nobles wanted to join the Navy because it wasn't a terribly pleasant life in those days, even for officers. There is a popular prejudice that the numerically insignificant nobility possessed all the political power in France. This had ceased to be true long before the Revolution. Louis XIV had initiated a very successful policy of concentrating most of the more powerful nobles of France at Versailles, bestowing artificial offices upon them and absorbing them completely in the complex and often ludicrous etiquette of court life, thus taming and domesticating the higher nobility who had previously presented the most serious threat to the royal authority. The effective government of France was not in the hands of the nobility, but in the hands of a plutocracy in which the majority of nobles had no share at all. There's been no more accurate description of what took place during the French Revolution than that of the historian F.E. Grunfeld, who writes, "The French Revolution, therefore, was the essentially chaotic and often violent process by which political power passed into the hands of those who already possessed economic power. In the words of one economic historian, it made the bourgeoisie the masters of the world." The classic medieval division of society was into those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed. Having discussed the first two classes on the eve of the revolution, it's necessary to examine the third, those who prayed. In law, the clergy ranked ahead of the nobility as the first estate of the realm, the custodians of its spiritual welfare and moral standards. The liberal view of the church in pre-revolutionary France is of an institution pervaded by ignorance and decadence. On the contrary, the ordinary French clergy were as a whole devout and dedicated to their parishioners, by whom they were loved. One of the greatest of all French historians, Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote, "I am not sure whether, despite the faults of certain of its members, there was ever a clergy more remarkable than the French at the moment of being engulfed by the revolution, more enlightened, more national, less limited in the performance of private virtue, or better imbued with public morality and religious faith. There was approximately one curé for every 400 inhabitants, and in the countryside he was almost invariably the only cleric ever seen by the peasants. In the towns there were cathedrals, collegiate churches, convents, hospitals, schools, and innumerable parishes, often in sight of each other. Education, care of the sick, and care of the poor were undertaken almost exclusively by the church, which owned about 1/10 of the land in France, and this brought in a vast income. All church income was exempt from taxation, but every 10 years a very large free gift was contributed to the royal revenue. This was raised by an internal levy on clerical income, of which the parish clergy were most unfairly compelled to pay half, which not surprisingly caused considerable resentment. The parish clergy were, in theory, entitled to 1/10 of their livelihood, in cash or in kind, from every member of their parishes. Many parishioners, however, managed to avoid paying this altogether, and even those who did pay very rarely handed over the whole 1/10. So the ordinary clergy, they wished ecclesiastical revenues to be more equitably distributed, and they wanted the wealth of bishops reduced, and parish priests to be assured of a decent salary. Since the Concordat of 1516 between Francis I and Pope Leo X, the king appointed the bishops and the abbots of the greater monasteries. Bishops were chosen exclusively from the ranks of the aristocracy, so if you're an ordinary person, you never had any hope of ever becoming a bishop. And they were usually the younger sons who often had no true vocation and for whom the office was seen solely as a means of providing an income. The notorious Maurice Talleyrand-Périgord is the most evident example of such a prelate. I wish I had time to talk to you about him. A wealthy bishop might have an income of 50,000 livres a year, while a poor country curé might have to subsist on as little as 300, although the average income for a curé was the very low sum of 700 livres. Even unskilled labourers earn more than this. And the parish clergy didn't come from the peasants, the poor. They came from the bourgeoisie. They were educated. You had to be educated to become a priest, which shows, just be careful about your passing generalizations that all the bourgeoisie were infected with the Enlightenment. So these were good holy men who accepted a life in which they were going to have a very, very low salary, purely for love of God and love of the people. And quite reasonably they resented the fact that a bishop who probably rarely appeared in his diocese and had got the position simply because he was a noble was getting 50,000 livres a year. Well, they got 700. There were other amply justified demands for reforms in the church. More schools needed to be established and depopulated abbeys to be closed. And monks and abbots and monks were supposed to be compelled to live in accordance with their rules, which very often they weren't doing. In the vast majority of monastic communities, the abbots were not resident, but appointed in commendam by the king. Our friend Mary here has written a very excellent study of the French monasteries, which really ought to be published. What that means is the king would appoint an abbot who wasn't necessarily even in the religious life. Could be one of the king's relations or the son of some member of the court, and he would get all the income that came to the abbey, and they'd appoint someone to carry out the duties in the abbey itself, and the people in the abbey would have to live on a very small income. And this wasn't something abnormal. There are 755 monasteries in France, and only 130 of them were outside this system. Only 130 of them actually had abbots who were members of the community living in the abbey. The situation with convents was very, very different. When Dr. von Hildebrand gave her talk, I was very pleased the way she drew our attention to the fact that there were, say, the visitandines in France. Was it 90? 80 of these convents all over France, filled by devout young girls who loved God and loved the poor, and were entirely dedicated to their religion. So the situation among the female religious was very different than that of the men. Henri Daniel Rops, he's written a wonderful history of this period. Well, in fact, he's written a whole history of the church. But he comments that most demands from reform within the church were very reasonable. Frenchmen, he said, desired indeed to reorganize their church, but they had no wish to destroy it. The starting point for the French Revolution was the convocation of the Estates General by King Louis XVI. This ancient national representative body had not been called since 1614, and the extent of its authority was far from clear. All that was certain was that the king needed its approval for the raising of new taxes, and an immediate and considerable increase in revenue had become a pressing need for the royal treasury, which became bankrupt on the 16th of August 1788. The reason it became bankrupt was there was a financial crisis triggered off by France's costly participation in the American Revolution. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, or Turgot perhaps, had been appointed the Comptroller General of Finance by Louis XVI soon after his accession. He began to introduce widespread reforms, and he actually reduced public expenditure and increased public revenue without increasing taxation. He established free trade in grain throughout France and began to remove the fiscal barriers between provinces. His mistake was to try to abolish the immunity from taxation enjoyed by the aristocrats, who not surprisingly put pressure on the king to dismiss Turgot, and not surprisingly the king did so because he lived in Versailles surrounded by no one but aristocrats, and was probably making his life a misery. Rather like if any married man ever wants to do something his wife doesn't want him to do, and in the end you succumb to the pressure. So anyway, the king succumbed to the pressure and dismissed poor Turgot. Before his dismissal, he warned the king that the proposal of the foreign minister, Charles Gravier Vergennes, to intervene in the American Revolution would be a disaster for France. Turgot told the king that it would permanently destroy all hope of financial reform and would not necessarily weaken the military and economic power of Great Britain, and he proved to be right in both respects. The decision to intervene in the transatlantic revolution was, I presume everybody realized, on the part of the French, it wasn't for any great love for the Americans. It was a straightforward act of revenge, as is made clear by the Welsh historian Gwyn Lewis. Lewis says, as a result of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, Great Britain asserted her superiority over France as a world power. French influence had been swept out of Canada, effectively undermined in India, and challenged in the West Indies. From 1763 to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the bitter pill of defeat stuck in French throats, helping to explain their misguided and financially ruinous foreign policy, including the bizarre decision to send soldiers of the absolute French monarch to assist Republican American colonists in their war of independence against Great Britain. Turgot was succeeded by Jacques Necker, who became director of the Treasury from 1777 to 1781. Necker also warned that the transatlantic intervention would bankrupt the country. but his advice went unheeded. Necker was a unique figure in pre-revolutionary France. He was a Swiss-born Protestant financier who wasn't an aristocrat, and he was highly competent, he was completely incorruptible, and he was totally loyal to the king. And as I said, his position was unique, but he had to be called the treasury because he was a Protestant. He couldn't become comptroller général. In theory, to be a minister in the French government, you had to be an aristocrat and a Catholic. Necker described the French taxation system in which the key offices were optioned as a real monstrosity in the eyes of reason. As a result of vehement opposition from the nobility and bourgeoisie to any increase in taxation to finance the war, Necker had been forced to do so by borrowing. The day would come when these loans would have to be repaid, but there would be no funds with which to repay them. Altogether, the American involvement cost the French state over 1 billion livres. It was the French fleet and the battalions of Lafayette and Rochambeau, who were both prominent members of Masonic lodges, that helped Washington to bottle up Cornwallis in Yorktown, compelling him to surrender and so bring the war to a close. This is rather interesting. After the defeat of Cornwallis, those French, American, and British officers who were members of Masonic lodges dined together, despite having fought on opposite sides. Revolutionary ideas, which were already well established in France as a result of the Enlightenment, then swept across the Atlantic from America into France, brought back by returning French officers like Lafayette. And they reinforced the strong hold which such ideas already had on the ruling elites of the kingdom. Between 800 and 900 Masonic lodges had been founded in France between 1732 and 1793. Two-thirds of them were founded after 1760. Between 1773 and 1779, well over 20,000 members were recruited. Few towns of any consequence were without one or more lodges by the 1780s, and despite several papal condemnations of this deistic cult which had originated in Protestant England, the elite of society flocked to join. Voltaire was drafted in on his last visit to Paris, and it was before the assembled brethren of the Nine Sisters Lodge that he exchanged his symbolic embrace with Franklin. I thought perhaps we could reenact that today, but I needed a tubby man with long hair to do Franklin, so we had to pass over that. So the royal treasury was now completely crippled by this unnecessary war debt, and Necker was dismissed in 1781. He got the blame for the bankruptcy, despite the fact that it was caused by not following his advice. And it's ironic to reflect on the fact that Catholic France was overthrown and its most Christian king guillotined because he failed to accept the advice of a Swiss Protestant commoner. The only solution to the financial crisis seemed to be the calling of the Estates General, because the king he just absolutely had to raise new taxes, and he couldn't do so without the help of the Estates General. And he hoped devoutly that the estates would come to the aid of his bankrupt exchequer by raising the new taxes, and they were formally summoned in August 1788. But the circumstances in which they were to meet could hardly have been less propitious. Poor King Louis could have complained, as did Hamlet, how all occasions do inform against me. I've already explained that nothing was more disastrous than for the French economy than bad harvests. And perhaps Father Brera could explain to us how often God doesn't seem to help the good guys. You remember King David in the Psalms keeps saying, "How long, O Lord, how long?" And it seems that before the revolution, God was doing everything he could to undermine the king. The year 1788 was marked by merciless acts of God. A severe drought stunted the crops. A hailstorm raged from Normandy to Champagne, and it devastated 180 miles of usually fertile terrain. The winter, 1788 to 1789, was the severest in 80 years. Fruit trees perished by the thousands. The spring of 1789 loosed disastrous floods. The summer brought famine to almost every province. State, church, and private charities strove to get food to the starving. Only a few individuals actually died of hunger, but millions came close to the end of their resources. Caen, Rouen, Orléans, Nancy, and Lyon saw rival groups fighting like animals in the streets for corn. Marseille saw 8,000 famished people at its gates, threatening to invade and pillage the city. In Paris, in the working class district of Saint-Antoine, there were 30,000 paupers to be cared for. So properly speaking then, the crisis of 1789 began in 1788, and the symptoms of agrarian distress endured until the early months of 1790, and later still in the southwest, where the barely adequate harvest of 1789 succeeded in containing the situation but did little more. There was thus hardship, unrest and anxiety in urban and rural France when the estates assembled at Versailles on the 5th of May 1789. Gwyn Lewis comments, economic recession and harvest failure transformed a political crisis into social revolution. That's why I was saying it's a pity God couldn't have given a little help to the good guys, but there we are. I'm sure Father Brera can give us a reason why this sort of thing happens. So, yes, the first and second estates represented the clergy and the nobility, as I've already told you. The third estate, of whom 2/3 had a legal qualification, represented the rest of French society. So you can see there's trouble in store when 2/3 of the third estate are lawyers. But these people represented the whole of the rest of France, but those who were eligible to vote and to join this elite, they represented only a very small propertied bourgeois minority, which embodied everything represented in all the key areas of French business and professional activity. On the 27th of December 1788, the third estate had been permitted as many members as the two other estates combined. So there you've got the third estate is equal in numbers to the other two estates, and 2/3 of the third estate are lawyers. In a letter to Washington, Thomas Jefferson expressed great hopes as to what the convocation of the estates would achieve. In every event, he wrote, I think the present disquiet will end well. The nation has been awakened by our revolution. They feel their strength. They are enlightened. Their lights are spreading, and they will not retrograde. Jefferson maintained consistently that the French Revolution was a continuation and fulfillment of the American one, both revolutions being manifestations of one and the same spirit of liberty. Although the opening of the Estates General at Versailles on the 4th of May 1789 could hardly have come at a more inauspicious moment, no event appeared less likely to lead to a revolution. I'd like to read you the very lovely description written by Daniel Watts of the opening of the Estates General, which was really the opening of the French Revolution. You see, the general impression among people is the French Revolution was a spontaneous rising of poor, starving, hungry peasants. You rose up spontaneously and overthrew through the evil king and nobles. This is how the French Revolution began. As the doors of the Church of Notre Dame at Versailles swing open, the voice of an organ reaches the expectant crowds. Led by a cross-bearer, the procession comes into view. First to appear are hundreds of men dressed in sober black and small tricorn hats. Next, far more elegant, members of the nobility in black and white satin, embroidered with gold, their plumed headgear stirring in the breeze. Behind them walk a small group of bishops and cardinals, resplendent in violet and purple, followed by two long files of cassocked priests. Each carries a candle in his right hand. Then, beneath a cloth of gold canopy, the Archbishop of Paris bears the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance, flashing like the sun. Immediately after him steps the king, wearing his great coronation mantle of blue, adorned with golden fleur-de-lis. He is attended by the Queen, the princes and princesses of the blood, and senior officers of the orders of chivalry. That slow cortege takes more than an hour to reach its destination, the Church of St. Louis. Every building along the route has hung out some piece of gorgeous tapestry, and the pavements are crowded with a throng of people held back by an unbroken line of troops. The three estates of the most Christian realm are on their way to attend a Mass of the Holy Ghost, begging God to enlighten the deliberations of the States General, which are to open on the following day. Thus, with the full splendor of the Catholic liturgy was initiated a train of events which for a time would appear to have obliterated Catholicism from the most Christian realm of France. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that an organized conspiracy within the Third Estate existed to overthrow altar and throne. There's some people here might disagree with me there, and perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that later. When the estates assembled, not one of them had the least thought of establishing a republic. Before the estates met in what may well have been the most widespread consultation of public opinion in world history up to that point, every Frenchman, rich and poor alike, humble peasant and artisan to the great nobles, were permitted to express their concerns in what were termed Cahiers de Doléances, books of complaints, which those who represented them were required to put forward when the estates opened. Where these books are concerned, nearly all declared themselves in favour of the king and the maintenance of the monarchy. The poorest people, in fact, were expressing their confidence in these books. They said what their complaints were, and then they said how confident they were that the good king would put these things right for them. And the Cahiers of the clergy concentrated on the just grievances of the ordinary curate, to which I've already referred. They asked for higher stipends, access to diocesan administration posts, canonries, bishoprics, and for a church government elected by synods. That the ordinary clergy who made these demands were in no way tainted by political or theological liberalism is made quite clear by the unanimity of the First Estate, that's the clergy, on the need to retain and increase the Church's control over education, to maintain censorship against the impieties of the Enlightenment, and to restrict the toleration accorded to the Protestants. There's not one expression coming from a priest at any level that the Protestants should continue to be tolerated, or the toleration increased. Of the 303 deputies elected to represent the clergy, over two-thirds were ordinary parish priests. Only 50 were bishops, and only 23 represented the monasteries. The Second Estate, the nobility, were actually prepared to make concessions, and there was virtual unanimity among them that they should give up all fiscal privileges and pay taxes the same as everyone else. As a group, the Second Estate, though, the nobility, they were far less unified and far less organised than the First and Third Estates. So the clergy and the bourgeoisie were the best organised. The Third Estate, the bourgeoisie, advocated the continuance of a constitutional monarchy, as did a majority of the parish clergy. The periodical convocation of the Estates General, the supremacy in financial matters, the responsibility of ministers, and the regular guarantee of individual liberty. William Doyle in his Oxford History of the Revolution says this, hardly anybody, and certainly not the philosophes, dreamed of revolution or would even have understood the idea. Certainly they advocated a change in outlook, a way of looking at the world, less dependent upon religion and tradition. There's another history of the revolution written by a man called Forrest, and he says, the dominant figures of the Third Estates during the summer months of 1789 were almost all committed monarchists. Men like Mounier, Lally, Tollendal, Berjas, and Clermont-Tonnerre, who wished to prevent any overt attack upon the executive power of the king. They were the men who were in charge of the drive for constitutional reform, and they would dominate the constitutional committee established by the National Assembly. The cause of reform, it seemed, was safe in their hands. The perils of revolution safely averted. It reminds me of the Second Vatican Council, because hardly any of the bishops who arrived there thought for one moment of initiating a revolution in the church. Just as there was no suggestion of overthrowing the monarchy, there was no suggestion of depriving Catholicism of its status as the religion of the realm. The more radical, Masonic and philosoph-inspired members of the Third Estate hoped to undermine the authority of throne and altar as far as they possibly could, and to extend the influence of their own ideas and obtain as much political power as possible. But I'll repeat again, as far as I've been able to find out in my research, I can't find any organised conspiracy to overthrow the king of the church. Some people would certainly disagree with that. Some people you believe there was a long plotted Masonic conspiracy to do this. The first revolutionary gesture in the formal sense, that of a defiance of the king's authority, took place on the 17th of June 1789. The Third Estate, which as I said was dominated by bourgeoisie, full of Enlightenment ideas, they didn't just want, they declared that they alone were the National Assembly, and later on they changed this to call themselves a Constituent Assembly, and eventually the Legislative Assembly. They insisted that all three estates should meet as one, which, as they had as many members as the other two estates put together, it meant that they would run the whole thing. On the 19th of June, the majority of the clergy accepted an invitation to join the National Assembly, because I've explained to you, the ordinary clergy had very just demands to make, and they thought the best way to get them would be allying themselves with the Third Estate. The next day, the rooms in which the estates were to meet were locked and guarded by soldiers. The king said, no, this isn't going to happen. We're going to follow what amounted to the French Constitution. Each estate will meet separately. The third estate was outraged by what it called this act of despotism and adjourned to a nearby indoor tennis court where, in a very melodramatic atmosphere, they swore the famous tennis court oath, never to disperse until the constitution of the realm and public regeneration are established and assured. And there are lots of paintings of this, rather musically, they're all making very melodramatic gestures. King Louis XVI refused at first to capitulate, and he ordered the estates to continue to meet separately. But then he capitulated to the fait accompli, and on the 27th of June, he ordered the first two estates to unite the third as the National Assembly. This was the first and fatal error of judgment on the king's part. He had surrendered to what could only be described as a revolutionary demand. And in any revolution, the first surrender leads to further and more radical demands. On the 11th of July, Thomas Jefferson sent a glowing account of the triumph of what can rightly be described as the French Revolution to his English friend Thomas Paine. The National Assembly then, for that is the name they take, having shown through every stage of these transactions a coolness, wisdom, and resolution to set fire to the four corners of the kingdom, and to perish with it themselves, rather than to relinquish an iota from their plan of a total change of government, are now in complete and undisputed possession of the sovereignty. On the 14th of July 1789, the Bastille was taken by a mob of gullible citizens stirred up by a group of revolutionary agitators. Well, I think this must be one of those pathetic events in European history. It was supposed to be packed out with prisoners put there by the evil king, and all they could find in there were 4 criminals and 3 lunatics. And they were liberated. And to celebrate that, the French now have a national day. It's more accurate to speak of a series of revolutions than a single revolution. One faction after another would take control, new leaders would emerge, and their predecessors would frequently meet their own on the guillotine. Effective power belonged to those who could control or manipulate the notorious Paris mob. These are the people called sans-culottes. The upper class people in France wore knee breeches, which were called culottes, and stockings. But the workers wore ankle-length pantaloons, the sort of thing Bill is wearing, if you want to know what a sans-culotte would be dressed in. So they were called, have you got them on today, Bill? The ones with the stripes. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that? Yeah. So they wore ankle-length pantaloons like that, and hence they were without culottes, so they were called sans-culottes. Mob violence had long been a feature of parish life, and on such occasions as food shortages or price increases, the sans-culotte would rise up. The power of the sans-culotte, manipulated by the skilled agitators of the revolution, was manifested in October when a mob composed predominantly of women marched from Paris to Versailles and invaded both the National Assembly and the Royal Palace, demanding that King and Assembly should comply with the demand that they chanted incessantly, "To Paris, to Paris." Both the King and the Assembly capitulated to the mob and moved to Paris, where the King and Queen remained until their executions, except for a brief escape to Varennes, which I won't have time to talk about. These, in the revolutionary mythology, these are the legendary October days. In the following year, 1790, Edmund Burke described the abduction of the royal family with a revulsion that must have been felt by anyone possessing even a vestige of civilized, let alone Christian sentiment. This is what Edmund Burke says in his reflections on the French Revolution. "This king, to say no more of him, and this queen and their infant children, who once would have been the pride and hope of a generous people, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewed with the scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. Thence they were conducted into the capital of their kingdom. 2 had been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter, which was made of the gentlemen of birth and family who composed the king's bodyguard. These 2 gentlemen, with all the parade of an execution of justice, were cruelly and publicly dragged to the block and beheaded in the great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, while the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along amidst the horrid yells and shrilling screams and frantic dances and infamous contumelies and all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell in the abused shape of the vilest of women. Sounds like a description of the feminist movement, but still. After they had been made to taste, drop by drop, more than the bitterness of death, in the slow torture of a journey of 12 miles, protracted to 6 hours, they were under a guard composed of those very soldiers who thus conducted them through this famous triumph, lodged in one of the old palaces of Paris, now converted into a Bastille for kings. In his history of the Revolution, William Doyle notes that the central authorities of the regenerate French state were now at the mercy of Paris, and time and again over the next 5 years Parisians would intervene in national politics in the role of the self-appointed watchdog of the revolution. There were periods when it can be claimed without exaggeration that those who control the Paris mob controlled France, due to the extent that the mob could intimidate the assembly. William Doyle remarks that in 1793 power now lay not with the assembly but with the new Paris Commune. This was greatly resented by the inhabitants of great cities such as Marseille, Lyon, Toulon and Bordeaux, who eventually took up arms to defend their interests in what was to be known as the Federalist movement. Their feelings were expressed by Jean-Baptiste Birotteau, the deputy for the Pyrénées-Orientales, when he stated in June 1793, "Anarchy has set up its throne in Paris. It reigns there by the use of terror, and its aim is to enslave the whole of France." How much more have I got now?
You've got about 8 minutes.
Oh, good, right. So now we're coming to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. On the 26th of August, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was promulgated. It was an explicit repudiation of the kingship of Christ. The French Masons actually boasted of the fact that the Declaration had originated in their lodges. The committee which drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man included the Marquis de Lafayette, who had achieved fame in the American Revolutionary War and was a prominent Mason. Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, embroidered a Masonic apron for Washington, and Washington wore this apron when he presided over the supreme Masonic act of laying the foundation stone of the Capitol. So now when you see that stone, you can mention to people, oh, did you know the apron Washington wore was embroidered by Lafayette's wife Adrienne? You see, a lot of people don't know that. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson had been the minister plenipotentiary of the United States in Paris in the 1780s, and he played an important part in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, using experience gained in drafting the Declaration of Independence. He was appointed Minister of State by Washington and returned to the USA in the same year. William Doyle lays stress on the great admiration for the United States among members of the Enlightenment. No doubt the original sympathy of the French government for the American cause, like the eagerness of their government to give encouragement and help the rebels, sprang from the desire to be revenged on the British for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. By the time a formal alliance was struck between France and the United States, however, French interest in America had passed far beyond the desire to spite the British. People had begun to see in America all their dreams come true, a simpler, healthier, more virtuous society established in a virgin land of limitless possibilities, a new nation constituting itself from first principles. Much of what Frenchmen thought they saw in America bore little enough resemblance to reality, but the message was nonetheless powerful for all that. Enthusiasm for all things American engulfed the country. Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador, and the very embodiment of the new nation's simple virtues, became the most sought-after man in Parisian society. The public was deluged with writings on all aspects of America and showed an insatiable appetite for more. America showed that new starts could be made, that it was possible to renounce a whole order and set up a new and improved one, that piecemeal reform was not the only road to improvement. It offered the prospect, hitherto merely a matter for theoretical speculation, of a nation establishing itself on the principle that the people were the ultimate sovereign power, which I learnt with great interest from David White a few days ago, was a principle put forward by John Milton. Now, this principle that the people are the ultimate sovereign power is the heresy that forms the basis of all the evils of the modern age. It claims, and this is very, very important, it claims that as legislators are elected by the people, they govern in the name of the people and as delegates of the people. From a Catholic standpoint, nothing could be more false. This is an error that tears God down from his throne and replaces him with man. It's an error which has since spread throughout the whole world and is taken for granted today by almost every citizen of every country, including Catholics, including most of the Catholic clergy. On the contrary, God is the sole source of all authority. Authority in the family, authority in the church, and in the state. When Pilate informed our Lord that he possessed the authority to crucify or release him, our Lord replied, "Thou shouldst not have any power against me unless it was given to thee from above." Those invested with authority in the state are obliged to govern not as delegates of the people, but as legates of God. The theory that the people are the ultimate source of authority has given rise to that concept of democracy condemned consistently and unequivocally by the popes. Now, the Church is not opposed to democracy if all that is meant by that is that legislators are elected by a ballot based on universal suffrage. What it cannot accept is that once elected, legislators govern as delegates of the people and have a mandate to legislate in accordance with the will of the majority. This evil concept destroys the basis of any objective standards of morality. In fact, this evil concept can be summed up in 3 words: we the people. Satan said the same thing in 2 words: non serviam, I will not serve. What is right and what is wrong are no longer decided by the immutable word of God, but by what the people feel is a good idea at any particular moment. We, the people, once considered abortion to be an unspeakable crime. We, the people, now consider it to be a woman's right to choose. We, the people, once considered homosexual acts to be an abomination, crying out to heaven for vengeance. Now, we, the people, consider it to be an alternative lifestyle, and woe betide anyone who says anything derogatory about it. The fact I'm wearing a pink shirt, by the way, doesn't have any significance. In Ireland, divorce was prohibited up to just a couple of years ago. 97% of Irish married couples were still living with the person they had married. Now, in Ireland, we, the people, have said divorce is okay, so the law has been changed. Henri Daniel Roth's remarks, considering the members of the committee that drafted the declaration, all were strongly tainted with a philosophical spirit, that same spirit which in 1776 had inspired the Constitution of the United States. The Americans had prefaced their code with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the French committee did likewise. The most alarming feature of all, says Daniel Roths, was in the preamble. This, while recognizing the natural rights of man, made no reference whatsoever to the rights of God. The Declaration stated in Article 10 that no one should be penalized on account of his religious beliefs. True, likewise, that the preamble contained an allusion to the Supreme Being, but the Declaration was nonetheless atheist. The revolt of the intellect, begun centuries earlier, had found therein its consummation. It's interesting to note, who was it, Chris Ferrara pointed this out to me, that there's no reference to God in the American Constitution. The French Declaration meant that Catholicism could no longer be regarded as the religion of the state, and liberty of worship was guaranteed for Protestants and Jews. The only article relating to religion in the Declaration reads in full, "No one shall be disturbed for his opinions, even religious, providing that their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law." The stipulation that the manifestation of religious belief must not disturb the public order was to provide the revolutionary government with all the latitude it needed in its subsequent persecution of the church. Now, was nothing sacred to the revolutionaries? Indeed it was. Gwyn Lewis, the Welsh historian I've mentioned already, says, "From the beginning of the revolution, serious contradictions began to emerge between the rhetoric of liberty, equality and fraternity and the reality of a revolution led by a wealthy propertied elite." And this is something you've got to keep stressing. The French Revolution was led by a wealthy propertied elite. Property, says Gwyn Lewis, property is the key word which unlocks the major mysteries of the revolution. Although the Declaration of the Rights of Man, passed on the 26th of August 1789, begins with a famous formulation that all men are born free and equal in rights, we have to recall that Article 17 declared property to be inviolable and sacred. So there was something sacred in the French Revolution. Among the first legislation passed by the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd of December 1789 was that to qualify as a voter, one needed to pay the equivalent in direct taxes of 3 days' work. This group of about 4 million were the only people who could vote in France. They didn't vote for the government, they voted for the electors. There are about 50,000 Frenchmen who were electors. And the 50,000 electors, they had to be far more rich. They had to pay the equivalent of 10 days' work. These 50,000 electors would choose the actual deputies. And to be a deputy, you had to be incredibly rich.